Hello and welcome to AmicusCuriae. You're watching ETNOW and I'm Ashwin Mohan. The banking sector in India has been hit by the alleged billion-dollar fraud at Punjab National Bank, which involves billionaire jeweler Nirav Modi and Mehul Choksi of Gitanjali Gems. So in the backdrop of this stress and scanner on the Indian banking system, we decided this week on AmicusCuriae to focus on a very interesting study that has been carried out by IIM Lucknow in collaboration with the Financial Planning Standards Board of India. And on AmicusCuriae this week, we have with us the two chief architects behind this report, and this report is on responsible lending in India. We are joined by Professor Devashish Das Gupta of IIM Lucknow, and we are also joined by Ranjit Mudholkar, Vice Chairman and CEO at FPSBIndia. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking out time and joining me on the show. Professor, I'm going to kickstart this discussion with you and try to figure out some of the key findings as far as responsible lending in India is concerned and some of the pain points that need to be addressed. And Ranjit, I'll get back to you later and speak about the ripple effects of the PNB scam and the lessons that can be learned as far as the banking industry is concerned. So Professor, my first question to you is, has responsible lending been defined under any Indian law? And if not, is there any parallel that exists in overseas jurisdictions? Let's first start off with this and then we'll move on to some of the key findings of the report.
See, responsible lending has not been defined from that perspective under the Indian law. Yes, internationally it has been defined in few places in Australia, New Zealand, and then some statutes here and there internationally. And yes, this is the high time we define responsible lending in an Indian perspective. And therefore, this particular study aims to come up with matrices which can then be used to evaluate responsible lending in India.
Right, Professor. Now, what are the key parameters that have been identified in this report to establish responsible lending practices in India? If you could throw some light on that front as well.
The key factors or parameters which we have looked into, the first thing is what we did was that we have divided our study initially in terms of loan application, loan processing, then loan delivery, loan servicing, and financial inclusion. Financial inclusion means the awareness or the knowledge about lending given to the public, given to the borrower. However, what we have also done is that we have created our own yardstick in terms of evaluating that similar parameters are available on the websites. So which we have done on the basis of 6 such parameters like EMI calculator, eligibility of the loan taker, then attractiveness of the website, vernacular approach, and the communication of the websites. So these are the two aspects. One is the one we have collected primary data, and then we have looked into the website in terms of responsiveness towards the customers.
Right. Now, Professor, what's the sample survey that this report has looked at when it comes to categorization of loans? That's really important because a lot of the findings are dependent on the sample survey. So if you could elaborate on that front as well, please.
The sample, we have only looked into 2 types of loans in this particular present study, which is Navigator Part 1, the first study of its kind in India. And what we have done is we have looked into personal loans and consumer durable loans. This particular study is limited to only evaluating the players from the players' perspective. We have not gone to the customers. Yes, we have asked the lenders, so we have gone to majority of the players, out of which some 10 to 15 participants have come in from the market. And then we have corroborated or authenticated the same thing looking into the website of these particular players.
Now, Professor, in which category of, or might I say, in which parameter of the ones that have been identified by you for responsible lending practices in India, is there the worst performance or is there a below par performance across the board when it comes to Indian banks? What are the pockets of worry that have emerged from your report as far as Indian banks are concerned?
See, if you ask that specifically, there is only one aspect of financial inclusion wherein only 2 players have been found doing excellent job. However, remaining all need to improve. That is giving information, that is educating the lenders, borrowers in the lending process and their credit worthiness.
Professor, now here's a question which seems to be on everyone's minds, and I'm going to try and elicit a response from you, even though it may not be directly connected to the report. While preparing the report, does it indicate a troublesome sentiment amongst individuals that perhaps when it comes to compliance of banking loans, the compliance or the burden of compliance is applicable strictly only on them and certain smaller companies and not perhaps on the big fish or bigger corporates? Your take on this front?
You are asking a very, very relevant question. See, if you look into the complete market, definitely yes. If we are looking into this particular study involves CIBIL -1 customers, and definitely yes, if you look into the present incidents, CIBIL +1 customers are being sort of dealt with a very, very soft glove, and CIBIL -1 people are dealt with a very thorny glove. So definitely what you are saying is correct.
Right, Professor. Now since we are discussing the key takeaways of the report in the backdrop of what has emerged at Punjab National Bank, and that is indeed a cause of worry as far as the PSU sector is concerned, the PSU bank sector is concerned. In your experience overall, what are some of the broader areas of concern when it comes to lending practices which involve banks and big corporates? What does your experience suggest that needs urgent redressal by the entire system?
See, as a researcher, I have not studied the corporate loan per se. However, if you look into the trends of the incidents which have happened in the past 2 decades, only the names change and the organizations may change. The nature of problem or nature of frauds remain the same. Therefore, there is a high time need for defining responsible lending, laying down the processes of responsible lending, even for commercial loans, what we have done this time for the consumer durables and personal loans. So what we are trying is that can we test these parameters, and maybe at a later date the same thing stands as a torch bearer, as a self-regulating tool for the industry, which can be extrapolated in terms of other industries. It can be commercial loans, it can be home loans, it can be any type of loans.
Right, Professor. Before I let you go, I have to ask you this question. Since this report concentrates and focuses on Indian banks, and we have a government which is very, very keen to adopt some of the best international practices. So what are some of the best international practices that perhaps can be imbibed by the Indian regulator when it comes to upping the standards and when it comes to more responsible lending practices?
Well, that is a topic of study, and if you look into the practices abroad internationally, European countries, America and all these, the stringency of norms and the short duration in which the processes are done, as well as investigations, as well as culmination of the investigations in a shorter time, is something which is very, very important, which should be learnt by India as a country when dealing with such issues.
Professor Gupta, thank you so much for taking out time and sharing your perspective on the key takeaways of this rather interesting report on responsible lending practices in India. On that note, it's time now to slip into a short break, but like I promised earlier, on the other side of AmicusCuriae, we're going to catch up with Ranjit Mudholkar, who's the Vice Chairman and CEO at FPSBIndia, and I'm going to speak to him a little more about this report and also some of the major lessons that the banking industry has to learn from the PNB scam. Stay tuned and keep watching the show. Welcome back to AmicusCuriae, and as promised, we now have with us Ranjit Mudholkar from the FPSBIndia, and he's of course going to speak about some of the major takeaways of the report that has come out in collaboration with IIM Lucknow on responsible lending in India. Ranjit, welcome to the show and thanks for taking out time. First of all, tell me what is the trigger for this report? Because it comes at a time when the entire public sentiment about the PSU banking space is perhaps at an all-time low.
Okay. The first at the outset, I must confess to you that this report itself was conceptualized last year more or less at the same time actually, and there is an agency called Brandvox which had approached us, and also I am Lucknow, and it required perspective from an academic angle as well as more research from the industry angle actually. So there was a collaborative effort which was required for this particular purpose. It is just that it has come at a time where I think this calls for a need for such kind of an assessment to be done about the market, about from a consumer perspective, from the lender's perspective.
Right, Ranjit. Now, Ranjit, what in your opinion are some of the key takeaways for the entire banking space from this report that you have come out with?
You see, this report is just a first phase of its kind in the country, while there have been other similar reports in other parts of the world. I mean, whether you talk about Australia or in Europe and in the US. And the brand Navigator has been consistent actually. So you will see a Navigator report in Australia, in Europe and other parts of the world. So in India, when we did it for the first time, we even as simple as we realized that even there does not exist even an association of all the lenders put together, unless there is a, like for example, when you talk about banks, there is an association, or in mutual funds or merchant bankers, there exist, or even brokers for that matter. So our first thing was that from a consumer perspective, what are the processes that needs to be seen to be good actually here. So we send a particular sample to the people, and then we realized, then we were trying to see that what is the key focus areas that should be undertaken by the industry. And we realized that there were the three focus areas that emerged out of the study. Number one, that there was a dire need for financial literacy actually here. Number two was there was a dire need for some kind of a regulatory approach which can be undertaken in form of a self-regulatory, because we are saying self-regulatory because a similar approach exists in other parts of the world, especially Europe, and which has been very successful, and it is focused towards principle-based regulations. And third, we see that if a similar approach is undertaken across the board around other asset classes, especially in case of lending, this would create or help establish a very strong processes.
Ranjit, now the FPSB, or the Financial Planning Standards Board of India, now it proactively guides the development and promotion of standards for financial planners in India. What is your initial reaction to an alleged scam or alleged fraud of the magnitude of over $1 billion that seems to have taken place at the Punjab National Bank?
Okay, I mean, when we speak about fraud that is happening, first I don't want to qualify anything as or a committal about, because I mean, unless and until we see a full investigation coming out, I don't want to comment on that. But having said this, notwithstanding the fact that the report is restricted only to the purpose of lenders, I mean, and borrowers which are at a below 15,000, and even probably who are below, who don't even have a CIBIL score, let's call them let us say CIBIL minus consumers actually here at this moment. I think qualitatively, not just qualitatively, even quantitatively, if some kind of a mechanism can come across or can be defined for such kind of lenders rather than just being brands in themselves, I think this will be a very good idea, in a sense that if there can be a CIBIL score for consumers, why can't there be similar indices can be produced even for even CIBIL minus consumers, because or even for corporate loans. If this kind of mechanism and the processes are established, I think this will go a long way where the objectivity will be well defined. I think a lot of times what happens is that even the objectivity gets defined, gets misplaced here in this case, and if the moment we have a element of subjectivity coming in, there will be bound to be clashes.
Right, Ranjit, now from a prima facie point of view, which parameter in the report which has been used to evaluate responsible lending practices in India seems to have been perhaps overlooked the most when it comes to the PNB scam?
Okay, I mean, I think first, since this particular report is restricted to sort of a CIBIL minus consumers, as I mentioned here right now, I don't think the parameters in terms of financial inclusion or a documentation would even matter for the larger loans or other documents here. I think, as I mentioned, the indices for the other parameters need to be sit down from an academic perspective and worked out actually here. Let me tell you. But whether is it sufficient, is the process sufficient? I mean, the fact that this has happened clearly shows that it is not sufficient. Whether there is a scope for doing something better, of course. Now, can this be quantified? The answer to that is yes. I mean, anything can be measured. Now, that measurable factor is not within the scope of this particular study. So, if you are looking at this study and trying to straight away extrapolate it to the larger case, it will not work for commercial loans like that. So, there will be a different level of parameters which will require to be adopted.
Ranjit, what are some of the key lessons that have emerged for the entire banking space when it comes to risk mitigation and internal protocols in the backdrop of what has taken place at PNB? What is the message to the banking space, and what kind of safeguards should they keep in mind to avoid a repeat of something like this in future?
Okay, I mean, let me just simplify and break down the question in different manner actually, from even from the lender's perspective and from a borrower perspective. You see, there is something called as a established system which exists, which has, whenever a system is created, it is always created with an objective that there will be a zero default. Let's be very clear about it. Nobody wants to create a system which says that let there be a margin of error for 10% or 20% here. So, system is always created. Now, the problem happens that when a consumer goes to a particular lender and there is a discretion which is used. Now, the moment there is a discretion used, the discretion will always be in terms of some kind of a process not being adopted or some kind of a leeway being given. The second kind of a distortion can happen when the data or the process is itself incomplete. And third kind of thing that will happen is when the fraudulent documents are being given. Now, we need to understand in such kind of cases that what exactly in which of the three categories it falls into. The moment we identify that, things will be, I think, much more simple here actually. So, if you look at just to take back to, let us say for example, the case which happened about Satyam couple of years ago. I mean, we know exactly what was the problem, and it came out actually because the CEO in fact wrote a letter to the regulator at that particular moment of time, and since things were very crystal clear, here this matter came out as a matter of investigation actually here. So, once a deeper one goes into, so out of these three category. Now, for example, a similar case, let us take an example that if, I mean, I am not talking about this case, but you see, banks are always into business of giving loans and not giving. So, if there has been a level of discretion which has been used, whether that discretion was within the preview of the right of that person, I mean, is also matters. So, these are some of the elements that need to be looked into.
Ranjit, what kind of expectations do you have from the central bank or the banking regulator RBI when it comes to tightening the entire lending regime in India, and also perhaps coming out with additional safeguards?
You see, first thing first is that all the lenders, all the borrowers should be treated with the same yardsticks in terms of the processes being adopted. I think that's I think fundamentally we owe to the nation. I mean, that's the first and foremost thing. I mean, there can be certain leverages being given, like, for institutions, they can borrow from foreign loans and all. That is a separate issue, or external commercial borrowings and all. I'm not speaking about that. But if there is a default, what happens? That, the way I think the person is asked even for a housing loan or even for a 1 lakh rupee or a car loan, I think some 100 documents are to be signed. Without understanding, a person signs those documents, and there are times if there is a even default, we see that even institutions would like to take away the asset of that particular individual. I think first everybody should be treated with the same yardsticks. Second, at a larger scale, I think there needs to be some kind of a regulatory mechanism that can come in, like in other parts of the world this has been happening, and I think if all the lenders could come together and form an association which could lead to a license being given by the regulator as a self-regulatory organization, this can probably be a good start actually, and opportunity being given to the industry itself actually here. I think these two are the basic parameters.
Right, Ranjit. Now, this is something I asked the professor as well earlier. I'm going to pose the same question to you. Any major takeaways as far as the international best practices are concerned? Perhaps something that India can borrow from overseas jurisdictions to come out with a more responsible lending regime domestically?
Okay, I mean, I don't want to even comment on international, because there have been even the failures of banks, and even there was a large institutions which have been heavily penalized even in the US, like Wells Fargo, what happened where there was a huge amount of fine that had to pay to, it was imposed by Financial Consumer Protection Bureau in the US. I think the most simple thing, looking at India's context being large, I think that what I mentioned earlier is probably if a suitable index can be prepared, I think that will be a good start actually here. And self-regulation, again, I'm at the cost of duplication, I'm saying these two things were to be good, could be a good start actually.
Ranjit Mudolkar of the FPSBIndia, thanks so much for taking out time and sharing your perspective.
Absolutely. Have a great day.
With that, it's a wrap on this episode of Amicus Curiae. Do give us your feedback on the show. This is Ashwin Mohan signing off, and I'll see you next week.